be fun, I think. All right, let's pray, and then we'll dive into this. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for allowing all of us to be here, gathered together to learn about your word. And you, Lord, just pray that you would bless us, fill us with your spirit, and Lord, give all of us something from this lesson tonight, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so, go back. Okay, so chapter 13, we just finished Romans 12, which is our Christian service inside the church. Now, moving on from that, we're going into chapter 13 here, which is our, I rephrased this, I at first labeled it as Christian service outside the church. I think more appropriately, this is probably more our Christian attitude outside the church. And as you read through, the scope of the passage really narrows as you read through the passage. So first 7 verses is about, I argue, government. The next few, 8 to 10, is about your neighbors. And then the next ones after that, 11 to 14, is about ourselves, is our own attitude in our service. So with that, we won't read all of the passage tonight. Let's just go ahead and read 1 through 7, and then we'll dive into that. So let's read. Verse 1, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever, therefore, resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same, for he is a minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Okay. And like I said, me and Dad differ on this passage, and so we're going to get into where that is. This is our 1 through 7 here is our attitude towards government. You could say our attitude towards authority. Excuse me, I can't speak right now. So there are really 3 ways that you can view this passage. First, that the passage is strictly talking about governmental authority, non-church authority, just external authority. 2, this passage is communicating in respect towards all authority. Or 3, the passage is strictly talking about church leadership, church authority. Dad leans more towards 3. I lean a lot more towards 1. And so this is where you can see the difference here. And if you when you read through the passage, you can see how we can come to a different conclusion to it than each other. And we could break this down. That is really small. I was hoping that was not as small as it was. But so we could break this down as to why, what we just read. So on the government-only position, first point, it's the same point as a church leadership-only position. Higher powers equals ordained authority. The government-only position views it as the government positions, any person that's in authority in a government or over you is ordained as an ordained authority. He's in that position because God ordained it to be so. God ordained that person to be in that position. Church leadership position believes the exact same thing. They believe the exact same thing, but in a different scope. Continuing in the government-only position, higher powers are inferred as rulers in verse 3. Point 3, rulers are a terror to evil and bear the sword against evil. I'm not looking at my notes here. Government has been an ordained authority of God since Noah in Genesis 9. Continuing on to point 3 here, I have a quote from the passage here. Rulers, specifically the rulers here that are a terror to evil, bear the sword against it. Quote is quoted here, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Now, I do not know of any verses in the Bible that refers to any pastor or preacher or outside of the Old Testament, some of the Old Testament prophets. None of them bear the sword and wrath against God's enemies. None of the apostles, except Peter, in that one instance where he chopped a guy's ear off. But since then, there are no other instances in the New Testament specifically of a minister doing that. But they lied to God, too. And it was the Spirit that slew them, not Peter. After Peter called him out. He did call him out. But again, you're not bearing the sword against him. 4, point here, tribute in this passage it means a tax or a levy. And 5, a custom here. Now, when I was first reading this passage, custom, as it comes off, different cultures have different customs. For example, in a lot of Arabic countries, it's disrespectful to show the bottom of your shoe to another person. And it's their customs. And at first, I thought that's what this was referring as, a culture's customs. But this is specifically referring to a goods or customs tax. So when you go through customs at an airport or something like that, sometimes you have to pay taxes for your based on travel and where you're going, what you're carrying, the goods that you're bringing across the thing. This is what that's talking about. Church leadership position, skipping 1 because we talked about it. 2, rulers are ministers against evil. That is true. 3, tribute and customs could be inferred to mean one's tithes and offerings, though you have to do a little bit of stretching. We don't pay taxes to the church. We don't pay taxes to God. We tithe. We give our first fruits. It's not a tax. It's an offering. 4, many governments commit and promote evil and sometimes even wield the sword against the servants of God. And this is one of the main points. Of that group side. And we'll talk about that tonight. We will get to that. And then the mixed position, the position essentially grants both sides of the points are true, and the position insists that we ought to show the same respect towards all authority over us. So with that in mind, whether you have a position on this or not, keep those in mind as we dive into the verses and what they say. We're going to do verse 1 through 2 here. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resisteth shall receive unto themselves damnation. Subject here is specifically to be subordinate or reactively obedient. There is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Now, again, as we've made point of, government, kings, leaders, rulers are ordained of God. Church leadership, that is an ordained minister. They're ordained of God. He is ordained of God. But one thing we have to remember is that all government is in that position. All government is ordained of God. No matter how evil or good, they are in that position because God wanted them to be there. And there's no government today worse. There's no government today worse than Babylon in the Old Testament. But God still used Babylon. Assyria was worse than Babylon. But God put Assyria in the position that they were in to be used of him for a specific purpose. Now, he did judge them and wipe them out, but they were still put in that position for a reason. And keep that in your mind. And to resist these powers means you're resisting God. And this is where a lot of the trouble comes in, especially to the point of many governments commit evil against those that serve God. How are we to react to governments that actively pursue evil against people, against churches? How can we marry these two statements together? To resist these powers means you're resisting God, resisting the ordinance of God. And with that, we're going to do something fun tonight, I hope. I hope it works out. We're going to have a discussion at the very end of this lesson. We're going to go over a few ethics questions. And there's four here, specifically just from these two verses alone, that you can easily bring up and are common questions, especially in churches in America today. First one here, and keep these in mind, and we'll talk about them at the end. Is being a soldier as a Christian during war, specifically during war, morally okay if we aren't supposed to resist the powers that be? If your government and the government that your government is going to war with are both powers that are ordained to be in there, is being a soldier in one of those and fighting against that, does that make you a resistor of that other government? If the powers that be make church illegal, is it then wrong to continue in service? As Americans, this is a tricky one. As Americans, it was incumbent on us to keep our government in check. So how are we to respond when our government defies the Constitution or laws in place? And lastly, is it a Christian's right to overthrow a government that is putting the sword against the work of God? These are ethical questions here that are getting brought up. Many places in the Bible bring up, we do our best to live peaceably with all men. Don't resist government. Don't resist your rulers. But then these questions come up. It's how are we supposed to act when something like this happens? How are we supposed to treat our rulers when something like this happens? The people that were living back in Paul's and Peter's time weren't worrying about democracies. They didn't have votes, or they weren't part of republics where their voices were actually heard by their representatives. In a lot of ways, our government structures today are very different from the government structures that Paul and Peter are dealing with back then. How does that transition? As we continue here, because I want to spend a lot more time on the back end with these questions. Verses 3 through 4. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Excuse me. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is a minister of God. And here's where that quote is from earlier. A revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Rulers are ordained to be a terror to evil, intended for good. Rulers execute wrath against evil. This is one of my points against Dad here, is that the rulers that are being talked about here are specifically empowered to execute wrath. Christians are never commanded to execute wrath against evil. We're to abhor evil and abstain from it, but we are never commanded to take up the sword against it. And this is where I believe government comes into play. Government was instituted for that purpose, to bear the sword against evil. So again, another question. What about, let's read it from there. Are we still to honor our rulers when they become a terror against good works? Are we to still honor our rulers when they become a terror against good works? Continuing. Wherefore, verse 5 here, wherefore ye must needs be subject. Again, that's subordinate, reactively obedient, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. We do not obey authority. We do not obey the authority to avoid wrath alone, but to keep our conscience clear. It's when we're not stealing stuff from the grocery store, we're not doing so because we're afraid that a police officer is going to bust in and shoot us. We're doing so because it's wrong to steal. We're not supposed to steal. So the moral question, ethics question here, is government, if the government is actively persuading or persecuting good, does that then permit the breaking of the law in other areas? And then last two verses here, and then we can get into the fun stuff. For this cause, and this is, I think, the key verses for this, this is clearly talking about government. Verses 6 through 7. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. For this cause pay you tribute, for God's ministers attending continually upon this very thing. What very thing are they continually working on? The bearing the sword against evil. That's what is the purpose of government. That's why we pay our taxes, for the most part. That's why we pay our taxes. The majority of our taxes, hopefully, go towards prosecuting people that break the law. I don't think most of our do, but that's the way it should be. That's the way it normally is. We should, to the best of our ability, pay our taxes. Fortunately. Kent Hovind would disagree. But Jesus said, so I think did I mention this? Tribute here, the word tribute, is only used in two places in the Bible. Here and in, I believe it is Luke 20, or three places, Luke 20 and Luke 23. In Luke 20, it's the Pharisees are asking Jesus, hey, you're proclaiming that you're the king, you're bringing a kingdom, you're preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Should we then pay our taxes to Caesar? And Jesus told them, render unto Caesar's that which is Caesar's. Pay your taxes. In Luke 23, the Pharisees are accusing Jesus of several things. One of those things is not paying his tributes to Caesar, not paying his taxes, and preaching against paying their other people, and paying against paying your taxes, which is a lie. And so, in every instance, in all three instances that it's used here in the Bible, it is directly referencing taxes, not tithes, not offerings, taxes. Same with customs. Custom is a funny word that's used here. Everywhere else it's used in the Bible, it means an end of a thing, essentially. But for whatever reason, there's a niche circumstance where when it's used in this context, it's specifically referencing a custom or goods tax. Greek is weird like that sometimes. We have words like that too. It's okay. But we should pay our taxes. Should pay our taxes. We ought, to the best of our ability, honor all those in authority over us. Again, to the best of our ability. Jesus honored the people in authority over him despite the fact that he was going to be put on a cross. He showed honor to Pilate. He didn't speak out against the Roman soldiers that were beating him, that ripped out his beard, that spit on him. He didn't talk bad about them. He didn't talk bad about Pilate. He didn't talk back. He showed respect. He treated them with honor. Even though they were beating him up, persecuting him for nothing, he still showed respect. So with the last bit of ethical questions here before we start asking about them and talking about them, should a person who believes taxation is theft still pay their taxes? If a person genuinely believes taxation is theft, should they then pay their taxes? And lastly, should we honor those that might persecute us for serving God? Hope I answered that one already. But with that, let's have some fun here. So, first question, and this is a group conversation. I want participation. Is being a soldier as a Christian during a war, so we're in war. This is a hypothetical. We're Christians here, but as a soldier in war, we're in active conflict. Is it morally okay to be in that situation if we aren't supposed to resist the powers that be? Yeah. Yeah. It's a weird thing. I don't quite understand it. God gives nations, national rulers, the authority to wage war. Don't understand it. there's no parameters given, especially to Gentile nations. The Gentile nations are just kind of sent off, figure it out. The Jews had a lot more information, but Gentile nations were kind of just sent off, do best you can. Yeah.
There's a couple different classifications. So you have your genuine gods, conscientious objector,
Conscientious objector, yeah.
objector, who found ways to serve their country without fighting. So unbelieving God soldier on that, and then even that soldier who does go off to Vietnam and does various stuff, the way that he follows, the way that he conducts there, still has responsibility. We know that people do commit
Atrocities.
that are beyond the scope of the commandments regulating war.
Of waging war, right.
Or who they get who would still receive immoral orders. So if they move in that house, find that later. Should not do that.
Yeah.
Criminal guilt. There's still a restriction. There are still restraints on that soldier. Does not get carte blanche to do whatever he wants to do or whatever his impulse is. So it is a requirement of our life. You're going to need to do a battle, fire a gun. I'm going to sign fire a gun. That is but that has to be the beginning of the objective goal.
I agree. Anyone else have anything to respond to that? Okay. On to the next question. If the powers that be make church illegal, is it then wrong to continue in service? And Dad is not allowed to answer on this one. Maya, give me your answer. You spoke up first. No, it is not. It is not wrong. Second question. If the powers that be make church illegal, is it then wrong to continue in service? Church service. Church illegal. Is it illegal to then still go to church? Is it wrong to still then go to church? Why? Correct. Correct. So, you don't have to answer the next question. Correct. So, yes, God ordained government to do a specific, to commit a specific role. God ordained government to do a specific thing, and that is to wield the sword against evil. When governments, this is what I believe, when governments act beyond that purview, they are in the wrong. And you have the obligation to obey God, the higher ordinance, than your government. You have the duty to do so. And we think about Daniel. Think about Daniel. I can't remember if it was, I believe it was after the Persians took over Babylon. So I think he was serving Persia at the time, if I remember correctly. They made it illegal to worship the God of Israel, Daniel's God, our God. They made it illegal to worship God. And the men that were in service to the king, and so was Daniel, conspired and found out Daniel was praying in his room to God, still worshiping God, still praying to God. And they told the king, and the king was distraught because he probably signs 1 million laws a day and probably wasn't paying attention, not realizing the ramifications of the law that he just did, because he loved Daniel. Because of that, he had to throw Daniel in the lion's den. Was it wrong? It wasn't wrong for Daniel to be praying. In fact, it was good that he did so. Because in that persecution of Daniel, Daniel was saved out of that den of lions, and the people, the corrupt politicians that were in that government were then thrown into the den of lions after him, and they died. And the worship of Daniel's God was then promoted. So not only was Daniel's civil disobedience correct, but it was actually the most correct thing to do. Fully intended. And we think of, I also think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they were commanded to bow down before the statue, they didn't have the ability in that instance to flee from that scenario, to get away from that instance where they could maybe get away from having to do something to not be caught or be caught in that. But in that instance, they're in the scenario where it's a do or die. Do you fall down and worship this thing and throw away your morals, or do you stand up for God? And in doing, and this is the same under the same king that God allowed to judge Judah and take away Judah into captivity. It's the same king that God allowed to do that brought him up to do that. It's the same king that then erected the statue and commanded everyone in there to pray down to it. When they didn't, they threw him in a fiery furnace that slew the people that threw him in. Because of this, they were saved because of it. Now, this is not saying that every time someone stands up for God and in a spite of persecution doesn't mean that they will always be saved. There are thousands of martyrs through history. All of the apostles, except John, were martyred. Even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were about to be thrown in the furnace, they said, "We believe our God can save us. But even if he doesn't, we still choose to worship him over you." And they throw them in, and they get saved from that. And because of that, then now their God is then promoted through Babylon. And we see that constantly play out in the Old Testament. Today, when the COVID stuff happened, in that instance, when we shut down, everyone shut down, everyone was in consensus of thought. We should probably do this. This is probably right. We got to stop the virus. We got to do what we got to do. Everyone was in that, for whatever reason, state of mind of, yeah, this is right. This is good. We followed in obedience to that, and yeah, it was good. Dad still preached at everyone through his phone in the living room. We still, to the best of our ability, met virtually and did our best to still worship God the best we could in that instance. But then later, when they kept pushing it back, we got to the point where we can't do that anymore. Can't do that anymore. They're not doing it just for our safety anymore. It's power. And so we have to be able to discern those types of instances, what's going on here. With that, the next question. This is a fun one. Maya does not have to answer on this one. And Dad can, but I want someone else to. Are we still to honor our rulers when they become a terror against good works? Government officials. Do you, though? Mm-hmm.
What about when they become a terror? So it's one thing to say, I don't like my boss.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing when I really become a terror. Either me, unless you know, someone dead, or at least a person on. He's a terror. Justin Trudeau is an absolute tyrant terror on
Mm-hmm.
the order of Fidel Castro, Joseph Stalin. Absolute terror. Canadian centre.
That's the question. You're in China. You're in China. Xi Jinping's the leader. He's a tyrant. He's a terror to good works, specifically the works of God. Specifically the works of God. Do you have to honor him?
What would it mean to honor him? You're a Chinese Christian. What does it mean to honor him?
Tribute to whom tribute, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. It doesn't mean in this context, you don't have to like him. Nevertheless, he's in the position that he is in. He's ordained of God to be in the position that he's in for a reason. Personally, I believe Putin and Xi Jinping are in the position that they're in because they are the barbarians at our gate. If we're not careful, we'll let them in. And it won't be good for us. And I could be wrong about that. And I hope I'm wrong about that. But Xi Jinping and Putin are in the position that they're in for a reason. You have to honor them, not like them. You have to show respect to them. Yes.
Yeah, I think that you would still respect. I've always said this. This is another thing that doesn't mean. He thought judges killed the terrorists. So, following an order of God, there are very few people in history that have ever had such a command. So there's, I think that.
Sure. But I think Ehud's is a unique thing because in that era of Israel, Ehud is a judge of Israel. He's more or less one of the rulers of Israel. Him killing the king, another nation's king, is just
Kind of a little bit
right. Yeah, exactly. And you could say the same thing about what about Joshua? What about David? Joshua wasn't the king, but he was he was the military ruler of Israel. The military ruler of Israel. His whole essentially his whole rulership was the campaign into Israel and the conquering of Israel.
Right, and you go to that, you just, I mean, the David, Saul, there,
Mm-hmm.
David and killed Saul.
Right, because he's God anointed. Now, keep that in mind because we're going to come into a question like that later. But I think I just thought of it.
I guess that word honest.
Yeah,
That's not what it means. It's more like a respect.
It's
for office,
respect.
particularly for the office of Congress.
Right. If you're battling against someone in war, you should show the enemy respect. Right? If you're fighting against, if you're coming up on the basketball court or the baseball field, and you don't show the other team any respect, if you're not careful, they'll walk all over you. I think of Lowell when I was in high school. We had a doubleheader, and our team neglected to show that punk team any respect. And they weren't worthy to stand on the field with us, and yet we still allowed them to trample all over us and beat us in 2 games. We should have been a state contender that year. Should have. But we neglected to show them respect. We neglected to show them honor. It's kind of the same idea here. I think of Daniel again, specifically Daniel, in one of the great and best passages in the Bible, when what's his face, I forget his name, the then ruler, the very last king of Babylon, is throwing a big party. Belshazzar is throwing a big party in Babylon. He's all drunk. They're having the big shebang in the palace. And they have the bright idea to take the golden chalices and the gold out and the golden cups and the golden plates out of the treasury, out of what they stole and, out of what they pillaged, probably a better word, pillaged from the temple of God. They took it out of the treasury, and they decided to have a party with it. And while they're partying and they're having fun, a giant ethereal hand comes out of nowhere and starts writing on the wall. And the Bible says Belshazzar, he was so scared in that instance that his knees were clacking together, and that he relieved himself. It was such a terrifying moment that everyone in that room immediately became sober. And when he can't, with the writing on the wall, he can't tell what it says because it's written in a different language or something. It's a mystery of what it says. Yeah, it sounds like it sounds like God is saying, like, neener, neener, you done did it now, which is basically what he said. He calls up Daniel. Now, they have just committed a grave sin against God. He calls up Daniel and asks Daniel, because Belshazzar knows that Daniel's probably the only person in the kingdom that can interpret what this says. And Daniel reads it. He knows exactly what it means, and basically tells Belshazzar, you screwed up, and you're going to die. Your minutes, your hours are numbered, and you're going to die soon. Little did either of them know that the Persians were already in the river of Babylon, about to conquer the city. In that instance, Daniel still was able to show Belshazzar honor whilst declaring his imminent doom and stupidity to his face. And that is where that is key. And even with that, when the Persians take over, Daniel is in such a high position of respect among everyone in the palace and in the area that the Persians allow him to live and serve the next governor of that area, which I believe is not Cyrus, Darius? Or is it Cyrus? Xerxes. Right. But so Daniel, in that instance, showed respect. Elijah, on the other hand, in the Old Testament, had a hard time with this. He was quite sarcastic in a lot of his remarks, I believe, and I like him for it. but Elijah still knew how to give honor to where honor is due. He still showed Ahab honor in the sense that he allowed God to take care of him. He allowed God to be the revenger in that. Now, Elijah did plenty of killing of the prophets, of the prophets of Baal, but he allowed God to do what he planned to do with Ahab and Jezebel. She got her just desserts. Next question. If the government is actively, this should be an easy one, if the government is actively persecuting good, so good works, servants of God, etc., in the same context, does that then permit the breaking of the law in other areas? Not in reference to service. Government's killing Christians. Right. Just the escape country. Everyone good on that one? That was a pretty softball you won. All right, last set, and then we're done. There's pretty fun ones in this one. I'm going to skip the first one. We'll end on that one. This is a fun one. We'll do that one second to last. We'll do these last two. Should a person who believes taxation is theft, amen, still pay their dues? And I'm talking genuinely believes that taxation is theft. They genuinely believe it. They are convicted of it, or they have a conviction about it. They believe it. Should they then still pay their dues? Yes. It would be stupid not to. That's good. That is a great answer. That is a great answer. Why? Right. Just because it's your conviction. God said, Jesus said, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's. Just because you believe that this is the way that it is, Kent Hovind, it's, if you are due to pay taxes, pay your taxes. Here's an interesting follow-up question to this. If the government declares that churches have to pay taxes, should the church pay their taxes? That's a fair point. that's a good answer. Yes. Yeah. Right.
It's tough whenever you know that your taxes are going to pay for things. Most of our taxes will not go for our safety or our tuition district. But most of our taxes go to pay for people's tax retirements, go to pay for children's lifestyles, go to pay for motivation programs where
we're still commanded to preach against evil. Should we honor those that might persecute us for serving God? In authority over us. Should we honor those in authority over us that might persecute us for serving God? I think we've already said this. We've already covered this. Is it a Christian's right to overthrow a government that is putting the sword against the work of God? This is not in a, we're at war with these people, where we're at war with them. This is in the terms of a revolutionary or rebellion sense. Is it a Christian's right to overthrow a government that is putting the sword against the work of God? What about the back of the room? Bree? Why?
Well, I mean, going back to what you said earlier,
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
they didn't overthrow the government.
Convictions. Anyone else? The Christian's right to rebel against their government if that government is putting the sword against the work of God.
What a lot of people in this country don't know is that before we were the United States of America, there were the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
Massachusetts was the lead colony. Think about Massachusetts.
Catholic.
It was a religiously founded colony, and the Church of England effectively called the congregationalists in the United States at that time, now they're called were in charge of the state. And Roger Williams, Obadiah Evans, John Carter did rebel against that government. They did rail against that government. They did not pick up arms. They were exiled to the wilderness in Rhode Island. But at some point, people in this country picked up arms against the tyrannical government, and God bless them. And I also don't think that anyone faults the civil point of view. No one faults the Navajos firing arrows at the cavalry coming in to try to take over their people.
Mm-hmm.
No one says that those people were wrong, not now.
Yeah.
And at a point, you have a right to defend your family. And but it's not necessarily individual Christianity, right? Say I'm going to go leave Harvey Oswald and overthrow the government.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to go January 6th and try to go stop the war. It's not necessarily an individual's right to do that. But there is some sort of a critical mass of things that I thought I was going to do.
Right.
It does break on that. The passage does act as a tether on that sort of idea. And I don't believe that either of those
That's fair. I, you know, I, the during this time, if I'm not mistaken, Paul is writing to the Romans here, a church in Rome. At the time, is being governed, being ruled by, if I'm not mistaken, it's Nero. It's one of the worst Roman emperors ever in regards to Christians. Yeah. He persecuted more Christians than any other Roman governor. And that's incredible because Christians have barely existed up to this point. He hasn't had a lot of time to capitalize on it, and yet he's still number one. There were plenty of Roman emperors after him. But he is incredibly the reigning champion of that. So Paul writing to the Romans here, obviously, no one in their right mind would attempt a rebellion in Rome against Rome in this instance. At this time, Rome has conquered all the way up to the lower shores of Britain, all of Europe, all the way over to at least Babylon. Probably just a little further, if not to where Persia was. I don't think they made it all the way to the Indus, but all of North Africa, all of Europe, working their way into Germany, up into Germany. It is an interesting question. At what point, because we did talk about, it is perfectly within a Christian's ability to be a soldier in your government's war. Perfectly within your moral right and okay, as long as you don't, have a conscious thing against it. Perfectly within your moral capability. At what point is a rebelling army now the authority? In America, it took, how long was the Revolutionary War? It was 10 years? 6 years? So, at what point, I guess if all the territories flipped, but they still had to win the territories. At what point, there's a lot of ethical questions here, and these aren't just for funsies questions. These two specific questions are, I believe, probably the most prudent out of all of these right now, because our nation, the politicians are crazy, and they're trying to get each other to commit civil war against each other. Each party is trying to do it. It's not just one, it's not just the Democrats, it's not just the Republicans. They're each pitting at each other to try and prodding the other to commit an atrocity against the other. God forbid the country falls into some sort of civil war. These type of questions will be prominent on every Christian's mind. Every Christian's mind. They should be. Do I, as over here in Oregon, do I stay out of the conflict? Do I join Oregon, who's probably going to fight on the side that I most disagree with? Do I flee to Texas, who's probably going to fight on the side that I most agree with? What do you do? At what point do you do it? Who's in power when that when X takes place? How long do you wait until X takes place? And this goes into our next one. As Americans, it was made incumbent upon us, thanks founding fathers, to keep our government in check. So how are we to respond when our government defies the Constitution or laws in place? And this is a deeply frustrating point of contention in a lot of Christian circles. Lincoln, for all that he's chalked up to be, suspended a lot of the Constitution in waging war against the Southern colonies. All we would have lost if Lincoln didn't go to war with the Southern colonies, all we would have lost was like 7 states. 7 states. Was it even less? It wasn't even 7? Well, so it was 7. And if he didn't go to war with them, literally the rest of the country was already chalked up to be Union. All we would have lost is 7 states. But instead, he attacks the Southern colonies, and then Southern states, and then 5 more, or 6 more states join in. It's like, hey, we don't want to be a part of that. Because in that instance, Lincoln is acting in a tyrannical fashion. So this is a history of these, especially in our country. This is a very prudent, ethical question. Ethical questions. And this is that fun part. Is a lot of this is where the wishy-washy. How do we navigate this? In the end, when we're reading through this, we have to understand we have to the best of our ability, obey, respect, and honor the powers that be, whatever and whomever the powers that be are, and whatever that they are committing. That doesn't mean that we can't flee. Doesn't mean that we can't hide. There are Christians over in other places in the world that this is illegal. In China, Korea, North Korea, there's probably Christians in there somewhere where they have to hide. We think of, I can't speak of it, we have missionaries in a place where they may have been had, not sure, so they have to lay low for a little while, make sure they have to keep moving, they have to move services around now to make sure that just in case they're being tracked and followed. And this is real world stuff. This is going on in our world. And navigating that, we have to do our best. It is incumbent on us, as it says here. You could look at Joseph, you can look at Daniel, and you're in a hostile area, you're in hostile territory. All you can do is make everything around you better. All you can do is do good. Follow God and do good. In Joseph's instance, all the way back in Egypt, back in the day, it got him to the second highest point in the land, despite the fact that it was pagan and hostile towards him. He was lied against. He was slandered against. All the kinds of stuff. He was sold into slavery into that nation. Or Daniel, his homeland was conquered and is now in service to the government that conquered him, his homeland. It conquered his homeland, took him into captivity, probably killed thousands of people, hundreds of people that he probably knew. And he has to serve that government. But in doing so, he does it with love towards God, and with honor and respect to those that are over him. And because of that, God blesses him. And so, principles for us to follow, and questions for us to think about and ponder. But with that, that is I believe this passage is specifically talking about government, Dad. But as we continue in chapter 13, hopefully next week, our scope will shrink in our attitude towards outside. So next week we'll talk about our attitude towards other people, towards our neighbors, and our attitude towards ourselves and our service outward. So this is our outward service, outside the church, and our attitude towards that. So when we're serving and we're interacting with our government, we're to do our best to be respectful, honorable, pay our taxes, stay on the up and up with them. With our neighbors, we're to treat them with love and respect like ourselves, like as we love ourselves, and to navigate that field. And then with ourselves, at the end of Romans 13, we'll see that the night is near its end. Time is running out. It's time to get on the block. So with that, any questions? Okay. We are dismissed.